Mr. Speaker, while I think it's lovely that the proposition can come up here and give us this Michael Moore-style sob story about industrial decline, and how it's super-duper sad when factories close down, they don't deal with the economic reality of the situation, Mr. Speaker, because they come up here and they give us these stories, while, might I add, completely ignoring the argumentation that you heard from Ben. But they never explain to you, for example, why it is that the benefits that they wish to claim are unique to companies having to provide this. These might be reasons that states or governments might want to provide the benefits that they're talking about, but they haven't explained why this is a burden that must be specifically placed on the company. We don't, and they say, well, it's their fault. But Mr. Speaker, recognize that we don't think a company is necessarily in error if they're moving a facility from one location to create better lives for people in another location, to provide those opportunities for advancement, employment, and greater efficiency and all of the benefits that Ben told you about, but were left completely ignored by the proposition. So what I'm going to do for you now is I'm going to offer 3 points of rebuttal before moving on to my new constructive matter about how the proposition is going to deter meaningful economic expansion and ultimately worsen every problem that they say they're trying to solve. So, first, I'm going to offer a point of rebuttal on the obligations of companies, this bizarre philosophical point that we hear from the proposition in this debate. Mr. Speaker, we are fine with some levels of protections for workers, so long as they actually make some kind of economic sense. We would not support a lot of protections which could be disastrous to an economy. We don't support these protections simply because, oh, we think they sound nice, but because things like maybe some temporary benefits can provide, ultimately provide more economic mobility in the future. However, they have to prove that on their side, and they haven't. But there's also this ridiculous characterization about companies as these awful leeches that come into communities, suck up all their resources, and then leave the first time they can find a better market, and that they never give anything back. First of all, I'd like to inform the proposition of the existence of something called corporate taxation, which is to do exactly what they're talking about, to pay their dues back to the community. We don't think they can just say, oh, well, corporations should give back, therefore we're justified in placing any burden we want to on them. We think they need to be more specific about this. This pays for the things like the infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. They needed to deal with that and they didn't. But I also want to offer a rebuttal on this idea of the race to the bottom and moving overseas. Because what we heard from the proposition was a gross oversimplification of the issue at hand. Because apparently the only time a factory is ever moved is when greedy CEOs want to move it from, small-town USA to a bunch of slave wage laborers somewhere in the developing world. That is simply not true, Mr. Speaker. If you look, for example, at the auto industry in the United States, specifically new investment coming into the United States, much of it isn't necessarily moving overseas. Much of it is moving within the United States. For example, in the American South, there has been, in the past 10 years, many new openings of major automotive facilities from companies like Mercedes-Benz, like Hyundai, like Kia, that have been moving production facilities there. It's not simply just moving into the poor parts of the world. But additionally, there's a lot of reasons why they wouldn't do that. Things like whether or not the labor market has the adequate skills for what they're looking for, whether or not the labor market is big enough or is in any way adequate for what they need. It's not simply just they want to pay people less money so they'll move it somewhere else. It's much more complicated than the proposition has given them credit for. But additionally, even if that were the case, they didn't deal with Ben's arguments about the fact that why is it necessarily bad to provide some level of good wages, to provide jobs to people in countries with much higher rates of structural unemployment, to provide jobs to people who probably live in greater poverty than the places where they're leaving. Yes, we think it is unfortunate that sometimes these communities can suffer, but they're not fixing it. For the reason, my third point of rebuttal, about structural unemployment. Because again, what Prop is ignoring is that structural unemployment is exactly that. That is to say, it's structural. And you don't fix structural problems by insisting that the status quo stay the same, which is what Prop is hanging all their hat on. If the issue is structural, then maintaining the system as you have it now is not going to alter that structure. So, how does this actually worsen that problem, Mr. Speaker? Because by artificially interfering with the economy in this way, you simply put off dealing with the bigger issues. You force people to say, if the United States were still the world's biggest producer of steel, it would not be very good at it, Mr. Speaker. It would be woefully inefficient, because that's why these places moved away in the first place. And you'd never have things like moving towards new technologies, or a green economy, or a technologically based economy, or developing new skills and new ways of building your own economy if if you just insist that the status quo remain the same, and it keeps you from trying to fix all of the problems of the labor market. But additionally, structural unemployment is also worsened by things like bankruptcy, which they have not dealt with, because when you impose this massive financial burden on these companies, they're still not going to be able to take these kinds of benefit. They're still not going to be able, Mr. Speaker, to pay out a lot of this, so they might just end up going bankrupt, as is very often the case. And when they cite, and it's very funny that you cite things like the auto industry on their side, because many of the reasons that the companies like General Motors went bankrupt is because they had these long-term payouts that they had to keep paying out to people who didn't work for them anymore. Back half.
What makes a town reliant on one corporation or industry?
The fact that they want to keep them around, the fact that they have like a labor market which is like geared towards that particular facility. Like it can be any one of those things. Maybe the company's in bed with the government. I don't know. But the fact is, they haven't, you still need to demonstrate the fact that this is going to be economically efficient and that it's actually going to be better to prop up these factories in these countries, which it is not necessarily going to be. Moving on, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about why this is going to deter economic expansion of my new constructive material. Because when deciding whether to open facilities in a new location, the kinds of economic calculus being done by these corporations is going to take a lot of long-term issues under consideration, and specifically things in terms of risk. As in, what is your contingency plan if this new factory you're opening doesn't work out 10 or 15 or 20 years down the line? What are our financial obligations going to be in these situations when they're deciding if they want to open a new factory? Now, if Hyundai is deciding whether it wants to build a new facility in Alabama to ramp up its production and provide better goods and more jobs, they're going to have to weigh the substantially higher cost of opening this new facility and the exponentially higher risk that they're going to have to deal with if they want to change their strategy down the line. That means they're going to be less likely not just to move these factories, but to open them in the first place, because once you open this factory, you've basically made it a massive sunk cost, and you can't move away. When the risk is that much higher, investment will be that much lower, Mr. Speaker. And this is going to worsen every problem the proposition's argued against. Why? Because fewer new jobs are being generated, which leads to things like demographic problems when you have a massive youth unemployment like what you see in Europe right now, Mr. Speaker. We think that when you are simply reinforcing these existing structures, which are proven to be inefficient, which are proven to not be the best way to move your economy forward, you make it stagnant, you prevent it from advancing, developing new technologies, new ways of using your labor market, and new ways of ultimately advancing your economy. And for these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Thanks very much for